Hi, thanks for tuning in today. This is Stephen Hackett at Biblical Studies and Reviews. I am very happy to introduce to you Dr. Maurice Robinson. He is a retired professor now of New Testament at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary,
Southeastern.
Southeastern
Southeastern.
Southeastern Baptist. Sorry. He served as a pastor for a number of years, and he is an author of a number of scholarly articles. And some people might not know, you're probably known best for your Robinson Pierpont text. I have the Anchor Cross edition here, but you've also done a lexicon, at least involved in a lexicon by with J.P. Green. And there's also an analytical lexicon here, which is something else that you were a part of. At least your name's on the bottom of mine, anyways. And this is actually, in my opinion, this is better than the Mounts one. So a little plug for that. I'll put a link for it because it actually has the Byzantine and Textus Receptus variants. So if you get stuck on a variant for the TR, this is nice to have. And so, anyways, Dr. Robinson, do you want to just greet our audience here and just introduce yourself for us?
Well, I'm happy to be able to speak online on this interview. And as far as introducing myself, you've done a pretty good job. I do have a doctorate from Southwestern Seminary, which might have caused a confusion, but I taught for several years, 6.5, at Luther Rice Seminary. And then I came to Southeastern Seminary as part of the conservative resurgence in the Southern Baptist Convention in 1991. And I taught there for 25 years and retired in 2016.
Yeah, that's great. Well, the reason I wanted to bring you on today is you've written an article that accompanies your Greek text, the New Testament in the original Greek. You can find it separately online. I'll leave a link for it, but it's the case for Byzantine priority, and that is a really, really good article. And I know people have read it and come away saying, "Hey, the Byzantine text really looks like this is what we should be using." But I would kind of want to bring you on today to see if you could kind of lay out for us maybe a simplified case for the position you take, which is Byzantine priority. Would you be comfortable to kind of lay out a case for us on that?
I had to pick up a book over here.
Yeah.
The simplified case for Byzantine priority is not the one that appears in this book.
Okay.
This was the same one that's on the internet, and it was published actually in the online journal TC, a Journal of Textual Criticism. A simplified version of it, which is much shorter, appeared in this book, Rethinking New Testament Textual Criticism. That was the basis of a conference that we had at Southeastern Seminary in the year 2000. And I only have a 14-page summary of the Byzantine text position in this version, but the 60 or so page version is in this one. But like you said, it's online already. But the story behind the simplified version is Baker Bookhouse, who published it, the Rethinking New Testament Textual Criticism, did not want to publish my entire essay. So they told me to cut it down. So I did. They wanted it cut down 25%. Then they wanted it cut down after I cut it down by 25% by another 50%. I wasn't too happy about this. So, in any case, the agreement was made that I would do a 14-page summary as long as they would put a footnote that directed it to where it was available online in the full form. And then later than that, in 2005, we put it in as an appendix to our full Byzantine text edition. So the short version of this is that I was originally a reasoned eclectic. I held to a critical text position, very simply because that's what the textbooks were teaching. My first critical textbooks were Metzger's Text of the New Testament and J. Harold Greenlee's Introduction to New Testament Textual Criticism. And they both were pushing the critical text and the practice of reasoned eclecticism. So That's what I adopted, and that's what I practiced for approximately 8 years. So it was that simple. But when I was at Southeastern Seminary working on the Master of Divinity degree, I was going to take the textual criticism course, which was taught by Dr. Nations there. And he told me I already knew more about textual criticism than he did. Okay. So he sent me over to Duke. And at Duke, I started studying with Kenneth W. Clark, who at that time was the oldest living textual critic in the US. And I started studying with Clark probably in the spring of 72. And I studied with him probably until summer of 77 when I went to Southwestern in Texas to do my doctorate. So I had a good 5 years plus of studying with Kenneth Clark, and I would go over and see him on weekends and things like that. And the surprise to me was that I had understood Clark and Caldwell and various other people from the University of Chicago were all in the reasoned eclectic field. So I expected nothing different. But Clark pointed out that in his own writings, he was quite critical of certain aspects of reasoned eclecticism. And also, even those like Caldwell were. And he said, have you read anybody that didn't support reasoned eclecticism? And I said, no, these are the books I've been reading. So he said, why don't you read Bergen? Why don't you read Scrivener? Why don't you read Edward Miller? And he named several others that were opposed to, back at the time, the Westcott-Hort theory and all that which led to the critical text. So I started reading. And then we had discussions about this. And what it finally came down to is Clark said the real weakness of contemporary textual criticism is that, unlike Westcott and Hort, who were documentarians, they just had a policy basically follow Aleph and B wherever they might lead, unless their readings were clearly a blunder or absurd. Modern textual criticism has departed from the Westcott Hort position, and they hold to reasoned eclecticism, which means you take each variant unit individually. You determine for that variant unit what is the best reading on various grounds, and they had certain criteria: the shorter reading, the one that would be more likely to be changed by a scribe, and the reading that explains all the others. And then once you've made a determination on that variant reading, you move on to the next, and so on and so forth. And you keep applying these internal criteria, plus a concept of what manuscripts are considered to, in general, be the best ones, which in most cases are the Alexandrian type of manuscript. And by putting it all together, you will end up determining a text for the New Testament. But the weakness of this, as Clark pointed out, he said, if you take variant unit 1 and you come up with the best reading, look at the manuscript supporting it, go to variant unit 2, and you have another different group of manuscripts supporting that. Variant reading 3, another different groups, and there is no continuity. And he said on a transmissional basis, it is illogical to determine readings on the variant by variant basis. The only thing that you need to look for is transmissional certainty, or what would be transmissional probability. And there should be a connected series of readings that a certain group of manuscripts, whether it's the Alexandrian, the Western, the Caesarean, or the Byzantine, that group of manuscripts as a whole on their aggregate consensus text should be following some pattern consistently. And he said, first thing is, the Western text doesn't even have a pattern. It's all over the map among the manuscripts that have the supposed Western readings. The Caesarean text doesn't even really come into existence until you get into the minuscule era. And when you get to the Alexandrian text, again, its own representatives differ a great deal among themselves, which, of course, is one of the complaints that you had not only from Bergen, but from Hoskier and various others, that if you're looking for an Alexandrian consensus, at many places it's hard to find. Now, one thing that has to be kept in mind with all of this is we're not talking about the whole text being uncertain. What I have found from my own studies and examinations is that approximately 94% of the text between the critical editions, currently the UBS or the Nestle-Aland, and the Byzantine text, 94% of their text is identical.
Right.
So
right.
we're really only dealing with 6% of the text, but it's that 6% where you do not have the transmissional continuity. Obviously, in the 94% of the text, everything has transmissional continuity. So, as Clark would say, if you've got the transmissional continuity as a general base already for that 94%, why do you depart from that to this sporadic variant by variant concept that ends up producing no continuity rather than finding a text that would reflect continuity? And of
Mm-hmm.
course, what text reflects transmissional continuity in that 6% in its aggregate consensus? The answer is the Byzantine text.
Mm-hmm.
Clark said, I've never written anything advocating that, but I have written things critical of the critical text and the eclectic concept. But he said, if I had 40 more years to go, and he told me this back in the 70s, he said, I would be spending the rest of my life writing to try to establish the Byzantine text as the most likely contender for originality.
Wow.
And he said, you're young. At the time I was. You're young. You go ahead and do it. So that's where my background came from. And it was really as a result of Clark plus the readings that he set me on to that I actually came to become a Byzantine text supporter. And I was at that point by 1976. Now, I already had been studying with Clark already from 72 to 76, but when I graduated with the THM in 1975, even in my THM thesis, I still was not clearly a Byzantine text advocate.
Mm.
I slowly but surely, steadily moved toward that position. And then in 1976, I got connected with William Pierpont. And this is what started the Robinson Pierpont concept. He had done already over 90% of the work necessary to establish the Byzantine text. What he wanted me to do was to check and verify his work because he had used as the initial step von Soden's material, which was known to have some errors in it. So he wanted me to check these things, which I would check against other scholars such as Tischendorf, Tregelles, and even the Nestle and UBS editions, where they had variants there. And yes, some corrections were made to von Soden, but for the most part, von Soden was already on the right track as to what he identified as a Byzantine reading, which he called K for Koine. But
Mm-hmm.
that's where I started with Pierpont, and the first edition of our Byzantine text, if you want to call it an edition, was as an appendix to the Interlinear Bible 4-volume set that was published back in the late 70s by Jay Green. And an appendix at the back of the 4th volume actually has the majority text notes that Pierpont had compiled as already by that point corrected by me. And most of my corrections in his main text were already the same, except it was not in a running text form. It was only in those notes. And we still had more corrections to make, and we were actually making corrections right up into the 1990s. And one final correction was made somewhere probably 10 years or so ago. We found one misprint, I believe it was, and we also had one reading in Revelation where Hoskier's apparatus had been misread, that we corrected that. But other than that, again, the work was well over 90% done way back in the late 70s. And
Wow.
so from that point on, it was tweaking the Robinson Pierpont text.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. So the kind of as I understand you here, it was the influence of Clark that really kind of began tipping the scales for you on this. And
Right.
then one of the things that really bothered him, and this is kind of a tipping point for me too, is that the critical text, like the Nestle-Aland text, UBS text, they can really defend really well each particular variant. But once you put those all together, there's some verses, just one single verse, and you point this out in your case for the Byzantine text. Just in that one single verse, there's no single manuscript that you can find that verse exactly as it appears in the critical text. So what you're stating there is that somehow that text in its exact form got lost in the transmission, and somewhere along the way, someone had to piece it all back together. And that was kind of a big piece of this for Clark. Is that right?
It's not only just Clark, but I wrote a further article on that beyond the case for Byzantine priority that was dealing with what Aland called his rule number 9. And it was that only one reading can be right at any point, is what his main point is. But the rule 9 says you need to have some transmissional continuity. And what I did in that article, I showed that not just what I said in the case for Byzantine priority, which gave a couple of examples, I showed that in the Nestle-Aland text, this was the 27th edition at the time, that there were 105 whole verses that, as printed in the Nestle-Aland text, cannot be found in any single manuscript, any single ancient version, or any single patristic writer. And
Wow.
these 105 verses, it can be demonstrated from the Nestle-Aland's apparatus directly that they don't have it as soon as you say, again, it's the reading number 1 in a verse, reading number 2 in a verse, reading number 3 in a verse, etc. And you put them together and you start seeing by the process of elimination what manuscripts are still supporting these verses. And you find at the end, it may be only 2 different variants in a verse and they cancel each other out. It may be 3 or 4 variants in a verse and they all cancel each other out. So you end up printing a text that ends up being a conjectural solution to a problem that shouldn't have to exist.
Right.
So
Right.
that's the first article that I did. And then there was another I did that was for an ETS presentation. And in that one, setting aside the 105 whole verses that we had, I looked for any 2-verse segments beyond that, where you have 2 verses like a verse 17 and 18 together that have multiple variants within those verses. And again, by the process of elimination, that's where I found another 210 whole verses in the Nestle-Aland edition that in those 2-verse segments lacked any continuity and could not be found in any existing manuscript. So that's where the problem lies. And the truth is, if you increased it to 3 whole verses or 4 whole verses by diminishing returns, you will end up, by the time you get to probably 10 or 15 verses, nothing in the Nestle-Aland text probably has actual support. Whereas, on the other hand, if you take the overall Byzantine consensus text, you always will have a reasonable quantity of Byzantine manuscripts supporting not just one verse, two verses, three verses, but 10 or 15. You'll have some manuscripts depart. They'll substitute a chi for a de or something like that, or they'll leave out some words by accident, or they might add something intentionally. But even these will be the minority. The overall running majority will still retain what is in our Byzantine text edition, showing again a general transmissional continuity that you don't find if you're looking at an eclectically determined verse by variant eclectic text.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's interesting. And the approach that you're taking on this doesn't necessarily really depend on. I mean, it doesn't necessarily depend on making an argument that a particular translation later, like some King James version advocates will want to gravitate to the Byzantine text, except when the Byzantine text disagrees with the King James version. It's not dependent on that. The argument that you've made isn't dependent on trying to defend any particular English translation or anything of that nature, is it?
No, it has nothing to do with any translation. Even if there's a translation that is made from the Byzantine text, of which there are some that are in the works or also out already. You have the Web Bible, World English Bible. You have the Esposito version. Uh, they're based on the Byzantine text, but it has nothing to do with saying that the Byzantine text supports one and only one translation of itself. Um, Translations may translate the Byzantine text, just like when you mention the King James Version. Yes, it's translating generally a Textus Receptus type text with some influx from Latin based readings. But other than that, the translation does not determine the underlying Greek text. It has to be obviously the other way around.
This is something that's kind of struck me on the subject here, and I wanted to ask you, and I think you touched this, but I just want to make sure I'm understanding it right. Does it make sense to say that the original manuscripts, the autographs, they were in these basically in this Byzantine area? I mean, they were in these key Greek speaking cities, and that the text was perpetuated in those cities. In other words, why would it make sense to go to Egypt to try to figure out what the text says when, none of the original autographs would have probably gone to Egypt? Why would we want to go to Egypt to find the original text? And I think one of the church fathers, I think you might mention this as well. I think it was Tertullian that kind of pointed his finger towards those uh, cities that the apostles had worked in and sent their letters in. Is that could that be part of the case for the Byzantine text, do you think?
I think there is the same possibility of saying, why would you go over to the Western Roman Empire where the Latin based texts are that led to the Vulgate? And the question is, why would we go to those to establish the original Greek text? And the difference is when you look at where the books of the New Testament were either written or sent to, they are generally going to be anywhere from somewhere in what is modern day Israel up through Lebanon, Syria, and then moving into Turkey and then in Greece. This is the primary Greek speaking region of the Roman Empire. And even though Greek was spoken in Egypt, there also was the national language of Coptic, which was down there as well. And yes, there is a Coptic church in Egypt, still there today. And the Coptic version has, for almost all of it, whether it's the Sahidic version or the Bohairic version, an Alexandrian type of text, which is no surprise since you have other Alexandrian types of text that appear among certain of the Greek versions that may have Egyptian roots, whether they were copied in Egypt it might be questionable, and they might have been copied somewhere in Caesarea or something like that. But you have Alexandrian type of manuscripts, which we call them that for convenience, that probably, if not copied in Egypt, had Egyptian roots and somehow tie in with the very strongly Alexandrian type of text that you find in the Coptic versions. And that's not a surprise because you have, as Streeter talked about, the idea of local or regional texts. So I'm not surprised that you might have Alexandrian type Greek texts that might have been predominant in the same area where you had the Coptic versions. I have an idea, can't prove it one way or the other, but I have an idea that the Coptic translations were made from edited Greek texts that may have been done by the philological know-how of Alexandrian scholarship, which we know existed, and they worked critically on various classical works, and they may have produced some sort of critical edition by Alexandrian scholarship that then in Greek would be then used as the master copy for creating the ancient Coptic versions, because no other versions out there are going to agree so closely with the Alexandrian text as the Coptic versions. But when you're in the other regions of the Greek speaking part of the empire, here you have where the Gospels were either written or sent, the epistles were written or sent, and they would be in the area where you don't have to deal with any translation Greek. You just have to deal with what is common in that area. And it is very likely that from wherever a manuscript was written or where it was sent to, that copies would then be reproduced and multiplied, as we know took place, and probably with an idea that the further away you get from the locale where a autograph of a given New Testament book was made, that probably the more deviations or corruptions might occur.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
But, it, but again, this would again say not that the Byzantine text is uniform. The Byzantine text has variant groups in it. The Van Soden edition pointed out that there's groups, the Ka, the Ki, the K1, the Kik, the Kr, the Kc, all of these little subgroups, but the biggest two of them are the Kx and the Kr, and those represent the bulk of all Byzantine manuscripts. All the others are extremely small deviant groups. So if you're looking for a general overall Byzantine consensus, the primary one would be the Kx group, and the secondary one would be the Kr. So this is what happened as the Byzantine manuscripts got copied. There were some deviations, but it doesn't affect the overall consensus.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. So let me ask you this: we're well, this first part will be pretty lengthy if we keep going on this. But I wanted to say, for your general simplified case, is there anything you want to add before we where we close out this interview?
Well, I think that as briefly as possible, that probably becomes much of the essence of the case. More could be said if we went to specific examples, but I think that probably just about covers the main case. But details, there are more, but it'd all be in the area of minutiae rather than anything else.
Yeah, yeah, and I encourage people who are interested in this, check out the case for Byzantine Priority. I'm going to leave a link for that, along with some of the other things we've talked about. I hadn't read the simplified case in the Rethinking Textual Criticism. I think that's a David Allen Black was an
Right.
editor in that or something. I'll leave a link for that book as well. But I encourage people to check that out because there is a lot of detail and argumentation that's there. Not argumentation like contentious argumentation, but in a scholarly sense. There's some really good argumentation in this. And so if you're interested in that, check that out. But Dr. Robinson, I really want to thank you for your time. It's been a real honor to have you on and appreciate you being on.
Glad to be here and glad to continue the interview.
All right. Thank you.